So, hello and welcome to the Poets Corner. This is our 1 year anniversary. Yay! In June of 2020, in the heart of the pandemic, we had a longing to find community among writers and poets and short prose, writers of short prose too. So we decided to create it. Throughout the year, that is the community. Throughout the year, we've had monthly readings and listened to many wonderful writers. And today is a very special event to help celebrate. We have with us today three amazing poets: Richard Blanco, Tess Taylor, and Rich Barrett. Before I turn it over to my co founder, Meg, to introduce our poets, I would like to announce that the Poets Corner has formed an advisory board to help us envision, plan, and grow in the future. Our board includes, I'm just going to read you a list of names: Richard Anderson, Richard Blanco, Natalie Goldberg, Ellen Goldsmith, Roger Leddington, Anna Limotas Salisbury, Audrey Minatolu Lee, Kevin Pilkington, John Paul Caponegro, Richard Wright Smith, and Sandy Wiseman. I want to say thank you to all of these people for their advice and support now and in the future of Poets Corner. Just a note, we are recording today's event, so if you do not want to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera. And Meg, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you also to our new advisory board. I'm very excited about working with you. One other bit of housekeeping, that our very next reading will be on the third Sunday in July. We usually do the second Sunday, but it will be on Sunday, July 18th. And it's our first ever open mic. So the way to register is not yet on the website. It will be in the next couple of days. And if you're interested in reading, I encourage you to sign up early. Because I think we'll be able to take about 15 poets in the course of that hour and a half that we do for our readings. And it will be fun to see who shows up in July, in the summer. So I also want to thank Maine Media for this collaboration with the Writers Harbor Poetry Week. This is the third annual Poetry Week at Maine Media. The very first year it was in person, and last year it was virtual, as this year will be as well. And I have to say that all 3 years have been amazing. The first was while I was still president of Maine Media. The next two I've been able to participate in as a student, which is even more fun. And this year as well. So, and the reason it's amazing is because the poets that come to teach and the poets that come to learn. It's just that group seems to create some kind of magic. So I want to welcome all those of you who are participants in this coming week. It starts tomorrow, Monday, June 14th. And I know it's a week-long intensive week of workshops, craft seminars, and readings in the afternoons and evenings. I believe there's a few slots left, a few seats. And if you find really by the end of this conversation that you just can't think about anything else and you can clear your calendar this week, I would say sign up at mainemedia.edu and you won't regret it. So that said, the evening readings on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights are open to the public. So on Tuesday will be Rick Barot, on Wednesday will be Tess Taylor, and on Thursday will be Richard Blanco. They start at 7:30. They go from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. in the evening. And if you're not on the Maine Media alumni list and you want to sign up, you should email Beth Story. That's BSTOREY @mainemedia.edu. And I'll put that in the chat a little later on so that you know how to sign up to listen in on those special readings, because you'll get a whole lot more of each of these poets than today, because today is more of a conversation about poetry with some poems being read as well. And I know that's what you're here for, so I want to get on to that. I want to give you a chance to get to know each of these three poets a little better. So I'm going to introduce each of them one at a time, ask them to read one or two poems that were written in the past year, and to talk a little bit about what their experience has been in this year of the pandemic, if you will, both in terms of writing, teaching, and reading poetry. And then after that, I'll go to some general questions, and we'll take your questions in the chat if you'd like to, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat and get to as many of those as possible. So to begin, I'm going to start with Richard Blanco. Richard, you're an old hand at this. You've been with the Writers Harbor Poetry Week since it began 3 years ago. And you've been teaching at Maine Media, what, 5 or 6 years now, I think. And I just had the privilege of studying with him in many of those workshops that he's taught. If you don't know Richard Blanco, you've probably been asleep for the last 10 or 15 years. He was selected by President Obama as the 5th inaugural poet in US history. He was the first Latino, first immigrant, first gay person to serve in that role. And until this year, the youngest, not anymore. His most recent book, which was published in 2019, is How to Love a Country. He's authored 2 memoirs and several collections of poetry, and he's the education ambassador for the Academy of American Poets. So Richard, I've read, the poem that was published in The Atlantic this past year. I saw on your Instagram recently that you've written a poem for the Commencement at Colby College. I know you're working hard on another collection of poetry, so I know you've been writing. Can you read a couple of poems and talk to us a little bit about your experience of the past year?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at Maine Media, so to speak. Being back virtually, at least, it's still great fun, as you'll see, and very great experience, even virtually. Though I can't wait to hang out at that Maine coast next summer, hopefully. I guess part of what's been happening in the pandemic is everything and nothing. In some ways, my life hasn't changed at all, because I just sit here at my desk and write and take care of business, and I haven't had an office job for 20 years. So in some ways, it's not changed in terms of my routine. But what I did find difficult about it was having to write about the pandemic. Because it's something that, I've always written about events or something in my past, but it's something that's happened, not something that keeps on happening. There's a beginning point and an end point. And so that was interesting, to engage with something that was sort of always in front of our face in some ways. And the poem that you mentioned, Megan, The Atlantic, was that poem, and trying to find a way to write about the present with hope, yet also in the midst of angst and anxiety about everything that was going on. And I write in spurts. I'm not one of those writers that writes every day. And this summer, I have a 5-year gestation period, longer than an elephant. So it's finally time. It's finally time to write a book, and I've been writing a lot, taking advantage of the summer. It's just time to birth a book, and so I'm going to share a couple poems from that book. And I don't know if this is because of the pandemic, or I'm just going through my own sort of midlife crisis, but as a poet, we can't just buy a Ferrari. So, so what do? We write about we write poems about death and about the body, not so much death, but mortalities of all kinds in the body, and appreciating life in a different way. This first one is a pretty short poem, and I've been trying to work and a little bit shorter poems, tighter poems. That's usually more narrative and write on the longer kinds of poems. But this is called "The Cutting." Sudden slip of the blade splits me into two. The me who was crying over my yet to be life while dicing onions, now gaping at the me of my gashed thumb. It's bleeding as if from another animal I accidentally cut, compelled to save it by pressing its wound with my dish towel to stop the blood, stop my pitiful guilt for having cut into the me of me. A tiny suicide attempt I survived to witness the flesh of my fleshless self slowly healing itself. How the dangling flap of skin refused to let go, tucked itself back into its bed of warm tissue that remembered it as its own. How the blood sealed, dried, then washed away, leaving me in awe of my finger mended without a scar, in praise of my body's own instinct to repair itself, in honor of its own will to keep being, and in my fear of how long it will remain so resilient, ungoverned by the other me's feeble thought, whose mind keeps cutting into itself, never quite knowing how to mend me or leave me unscarred. And this other poem, I thought I'd read this one. It's because of my class's their theme about writing about photographs. This is based on a series of photographs by Joyce Tennyson, who is a instructor and a longtime friend of Maine Media and a longtime friend of mine as well. And it's a series she did on flowers. It's just where she began, I believe, her career, and then has come back to this now in a new way. And the collection of photos or the series is called Radiant Beings. And this is a poem. I guess it's not just one photo, but it on sort of the grouping of the photos. So it's ekphrastic in a little bit of a different way. It's called Radiant Beings, Photos by Joyce Tennyson. The leathery mouths of calla lilies you kiss with your lens until their mute tongues tell me all of us are just as thirsty for rainfall's love. How your eye meets a Gibberus eye, sees it as the center of some sun's petals flaring with my wish for pinks to light all our days. The perfectly crinkled faces of dahlias you blur to refocus me on the letting go of beauty as the truest beauty of our ageless aging. Our gray minds you frame as the purple globes of allium swaying in the wind of my thoughts, trying not to break from my body's stem. The night you lit up with Chinese lantern flowers on your dinner table, gazed at the impossible glow of their orange hearts, and asked me, aren't they gorgeous? As if I could say anything but yes, yes. Though I wanted to answer you by asking you now, what is it about flowers? Flowers everywhere, in the trembling hands of brides or widows, laid on granite graves or strewn like confetti over honeymoon beds. Flowers like life's centerpiece at every party, always the perfect gift for our mothers, lovers, or our dead, and ourselves on days when we're dead. Flowers strung around our wrists or as crowns haloing our heads, pinned to our lapels or peeking in our windows boxes, or simply flowers we cut, arrange in a vase like a painting, place on the kitchen counter, and watch them every day, hoping and more than the everyday. Watch them wilt, bow, die, believing that either our flesh is just as fleeting or that we too remain the forever of radiant beings you've captured, blooming in your photos, in you, in me, in us all, flowering. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was wonderful. And I haven't seen Joyce's collection of flowers yet. I can't wait to. That what a beautiful poem about that. All right. Let's move on to Tess Taylor. Tess is the author of 5 collections of poetry, including 2 that were published in 2020. Her collection, Riff Zones, published in 2020, was named as one of the best books of the year by the Boston Globe. She's a critic also, whose work appears on NPR, the New York Times Book Review, CNN, and a recent interview on PBS NewsHour series called Canvas. She's also a wonderful teacher. I had the pleasure of taking one of her workshops this spring, and it gave me incredible insights into my poetry and just an opportunity to see it in new ways with fresh eyes and different approaches. Her workshop this coming week is all about place, landscape, story, history. And that's what a lot of her poems have been about. Riff Zones particularly spoke to me with my interest in geology and landscape, but I think it speaks to all of us in very different ways. So Tess, it's your turn to read, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Meg. Thanks for having me. Do you hear me okay?
I can. I need to find you and pin you. Let me see if I can't do that. Sorry about that. Yeah, remove Richard's pin and pin you. Great.
Cool. Are we good?
Good.
Great. So I love this question of thinking about what this year has done to our writing, and it was interesting for me in a couple ways. One is I'm a parent, so the first part of the pandemic, before we were able to build what I like to call the Noah's Ark world, where everyone got at least one friend, we had a sort of a trusted pod, was really, really scary and traumatic and hard to be responsible day in and day out for your kids, and trying to keep them safe. And so a lot of writing went by the wayside. It was also a year of disappointment. My books launched in February and April 2020, and the second one launched really right after the shutdown of California. And I ended up making a video recording of reading in a graveyard because all the parks were closed, and that was the one place I could think of to go and set up and read with my friend Judy Halebsky. So that was a strange thing. But the other thing is I'm a poet who loves archives and history and museums, and have often gone out into the world to research things like the geology of California, or the history of my family, or the history of Dorothea Lange photographing California. I love to go to archives, but guess what? There's no archives to go to. So I found myself writing and living on a different scale. I had planned to be on tour all year in 43 cities in 3 countries, and that didn't happen. I was home in my Zoom corner, which I'm here in, and really, really with domestic space. And so my poems just took place on a different scale, and my writing took place on a different scale. And I just thought I would read, and you know what? A year later, and as I've been gathering them together, I love what actually has happened in terms of this small scale and the tenderness of it. Um, which doesn't mean I wouldn't love to go back out in the world and go to an archive or go to an art museum. And it doesn't mean that I'm not so relieved to have my kids back in school. But there was something really remarkable about the limitation of living around this one block. My garden is in really good shape right now. I'll just put it that way. So I'll read 2 poems from this year. Poem for Heartbreak. On a morning of sorrow, I soak the beans. In the face of grief, wash the kale's particulate dirt. Smooth purple veins in the collard, mineral earth glitters in our basin, the slow grandchild of ocean and mountain. There are horrors to take in today, but before I do, I will peel sweet potatoes. I am making a meal for the journey. We will hold ourselves up on this coming day. Each potato still a gift of the earth. I fondle their silence, their musk, underground hardness. Their cold steadies my hands. Again and again, I hear my heavy knife heave them open and open against the wood board. And this poem came about when I thought of this title, and the title lodged in my head and sort of sparked a conversation. And the title is Patience is Not My Strong Suit. Patience is not my strong suit, I have said, but today I suddenly felt as if my suit was stronger than I'd imagined. I saw it there, soft gray wool hanging in mind. I admired it, woven of a lifetime. It is bright slate like clouds after storm. I've spent so much of my life frenzied and desiring. Now I realize this suit has also been my companion, holding its deliberate pose. It is a gift I can open and reopen. It wears well, can wrinkle, will travel. It can be washed cold and then laid flat in the sun. It holds lavender and the handkerchief I pocket against sorrow. Yes, now I see it, my strong suit, which I've worn to all my disappointments, and also beyond them, when after sharp tulips push up at the edge of the lawn. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Tess. I love that patience is not my strong suit and the way you embodied that. And I can identify with how I'm in so well. And I also love that you wrote about slicing potatoes and Richard was reading about slicing onions. It's funny how that happens in the course of reading. Thank you. I'm gonna turn now to Rick Barot. Rick also, well, let me do this unpin pin. Maybe Richard, you could do that for us, our host, or if I can figure that out again. Sorry. All right, we should have Rick pinned. So Rick also published a collection in 2020 called The Galleons, his 4th book of poetry. He's won numerous awards for his poems, and they've been published in Poetry Magazine, The New Republic, Tin House, The Kenyon Review, and The New Yorker. He lives in Tacoma, Washington, and directs the Rainier Writing Workshop. And they're which is their low residency MFA program. And he's the poetry editor for the New England Review. I took an amazing workshop with Rick last winter on syntax. And I know that students in his workshop this coming week, entitled Risk and Ingenuity, are in for a lot of fun in the week ahead. So, Rick?
Thank you so much, Meg. It's so good to be here with all of you. Can you hear me? Are we good with sound? Okay. So just to pick up on the question of how the last year or so has been for me, I think that in addition to the kind of common fear and isolation and uncertainty that I think all of us felt, there were some very specific impacts that I can speak to. Like Tess, I had a book that came out during the pandemic in February 2020. And so that meant that, you know, several dozen events that I was planning to do ended up being on Zoom. But I have to say that one of the things I learned is that there can be an intense sense of community and communion that happens in these Zoom spaces. So I was really grateful for that, you know, I could be at home and be safe, but also be with a lot of others in kind of common cause emotionally and poetically. So that was wonderful for me as a kind of side benefit to not having gone on the road. The other important thing for me this last year was my teaching. I teach undergrads and I teach a couple of classes per semester. So last spring and this whole past year, everything was on Zoom. And, you know, I've heard many bad stories about how terrible it was for teachers not being in the same room with their students. But I had the great fortune of teaching smaller creative writing classes in my undergraduate institution. And so for the students, they really yearned to be in these small classes, especially when they were writing, because they could express themselves and process what they were going through. And so it really felt as though the class was a kind of emotional and psychological hub for them and for myself. So I really loved being a teacher this past year, especially during a time of such crisis for my students. And so, you know, it was interesting to just learn that technologically, a lot of sort of like warmth and good could come through the Zoom. So those are important sort of highlights that I take away from the last year, although I'm ready to be back in the world like all of you are. So I'm going to read some poems that are in fact directly about the pandemic experience. In March 2020, I wrote a series of 30 short prose poems about the experience of the pandemic, and especially in that dark first month or two of the first lockdown. And I'm going to read just a few of these poems from the sequence. Each poem begins with the phrase, "during the pandemic." And the sequence itself is called "During the Pandemic." And I was lucky to have this chapbook, this sequence published as a chapbook in the fall by Albion Books. So these are poems from a chapbook called "During the Pandemic." During the pandemic, I kept a list of possible symptoms on the refrigerator door. From a distance, it looked like a shopping list, an ersatz normalcy. Fever instead of flour, cough instead of bacon, fatigue instead of milk. With each day, the slippages proliferated. Hospital instead of hospitality, projections instead of protections, virus instead of virtue. Asymptomatic veered towards asymptote, an intimate infinity between them. During the pandemic, I thought of scale. Pandemics, I read, had shaped human history from the start, like lava scorching an old landscape with regularity. This was one kind of scale. The tweet from the man announcing his wife's death from the virus was another kind of scale. Soft, the size of my face, the mask I wore to the store was one kind of scale. The racist violence being done to people who looked like me, this was another kind of scale. The poem is the speech of citizenship, a scholar wrote, and I laughed. During the pandemic, I praised the cherry blossoms. I praised my lungs. I praised crying. I praised the faces of my students checkerboarded on the computer screen. I praised the curses I gave to those who deserve them. I praised coffee. I praised ventilators. I praised the people gathered on the rooftop of a nearby building, laughing as they looked up at the night sky. Thank you all for listening to that.
Thank you, Rick. That was great. That was great. And it's such universal and insightful memories, hopefully, of the pandemic. It's good to have it somewhat in the past. So I wondered what each of you are looking forward to as things open up. What have you missed, and what do you want to keep?
I think it's an amazing time to be intentional. And I think many of us have discovered new things that serve us and things that also maybe we don't want to return to. It's worth noticing that as a globe, carbon emissions dropped 7% because of transportation. And then in our own personal lives, the wildlife that I've seen just in my neighborhood, the consciousness of the time when the monarch caterpillars are out and when the monarchs come through California, the sense of connection to my neighbors. Those are things I don't want to give up. And then this thing of knowing that we are building this community together. Something that was interesting was thinking about the role of art. And somebody said something beautiful to me that I really have taken with me, which is that artists are second responders. So what Rick was saying was really moving to me to realize that, you know, during the pandemic, there was a whole tranche of first responders that we needed, but there was also this turning to art as a solace and art as community and art as repair. And I think that sense in me felt like a really, really grounding and important sense that we are building something together for one another in this realm. And of course we always were, but I think there was something really blurry and busy, for me at least, in the last years before the pandemic. And I just hope to take some of the rootedness with me.
Mm-hmm.
I love that thought. I mean, in some ways our world shrank, but in some ways it expanded.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add a couple of things to that came to mind. The first one has to do with the kind of the sense that art and writing gained an incredible intensity for a lot of us during the pandemic. And what does that mean? And I'm reminded of an old teacher of mine, Jerry Graham, who talks about poetry as being a cleansing of language after it has been damaged and badly used by other means. And so I love that reminder that, you know, poetry and art can have that kind of cleansing, that kind of responding effect on language and also on living, obviously. And I think another thing that really got highlighted for me was the idea of, as I think Tess pointed out, kind of re-seeing with intensity your commitments. So much sort of fell away and the important things came to the fore and I could really see them. And so that was important to me, that people first and stuff much later. And that's what I'm looking forward to now, is reconnecting in real life with the people who I love. I've just had a visit with my parents and my sister here in Washington State. I hadn't seen them in at least 6 months, and that was incredible to just spend time with people sort of in the flesh, and to be in that kind of space where you're not wary all the time of other people, that can finally relax into love. That was wonderful.
Yeah, to be able to touch them and hug them, you know, isn't that wonderful?
I felt, I think one of the things I missed most, and I've appreciated or reappreciated, was that how much of poetry is a communal act, how much a poetry reading means, the interaction, the live interaction with an audience, and the energy that's exchanged, and poetry's DNA, or in the way it was born, right? As a proverbial campfire that we gather around, and I truly miss. You know, even though Zoom has opened up many other opportunities to share work, you know, we'll finish here tonight and I'll just jump back on email, right? There's no ceremony. Everything's sort of, and that exchange and the book signing and people telling their stories and you laughing and whatnot and crying together. I love that. I think I miss that, and I really appreciate that. And I think that also has to do with the other thing that I've been thinking about, the pandemic, that shifted my thinking. A lot of my work, a lot of my obsession is about home, place, community, and thinking about what that really means. Uh, that you know, you just take for granted, you know, the person at the post office or the cashier at the supermarket, and suddenly realizing that it really does take a village to not only raise a child just for us to exist, and and what pandemic has highlighted is so many social inequities that there are, right? That everyone has an essential role, and that makes or that makes our quality of life collectively. And I really sort of hope that's something I continue to remember, continue to appreciate, that we all continue to appreciate, um, having learned that. But yeah, that home is much larger than just, you know, my hideaway up here in Maine. That home really does mean everyone in a community, and so my sense of home has shifted in some ways to who I need in my life and who I appreciate, and understanding that yeah, that my life exists because of what other people do as well, not just what I do as a poet, but that each of us have some essential. We're all in some ways essential workers, right? In other words.
That's great. You know, the sense that we are all essential workers, and missing those casual contacts with people that we don't sometimes don't even know their names, but we miss them. Yeah. I wondered if you'd each talk a little bit about your creative practice, your creative habits. You know, some of you touched on that, whether you write every day or you don't, where your ideas come from, that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'll jump in and just say that for me, my creative process, um, the actual putting down of language on the page is really just sort of a small portion of that. I think of it as a longer, kind of bigger ecosystem that involves my creativity and my whole self. I have a kind of robust set of habits that includes reading and taking notes and paying attention. I write in a journal, and all of those are part of my poem writing process. The poems, in a way, become a byproduct of a whole bigger thing. And so that when I finally do write the poem, it is emerging from a kind of wonderful chaos that my whole life has sort of, like, you know, directed towards the poem. And so I never isolate my process to just that part where I'm putting things down in a draft. Everything contributes to that draft, even the parts of the process that might be, thought of as wasteful or, kind of laborious towards no use, I really don't demonize those parts of my process. It's all part of the big thing. Then the last thing I'll say is that, I am, maybe this is a kind of an occupational kind of like tick, but I'm always on high alert for things that I want to make note of, whether it's ideas or phrases or images or overheard language or things that I notice in my reading. So I'm constantly collecting and gathering all the time. And that to me is a crucial and important part of my process.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Rick because I feel there's an affinity with what you said, Rick. When I was studying architecture, someone told me there's, that there's architecture everywhere and in everything, right? In this pen, there's architecture, and I've always remembered that in terms of there's poetry everywhere, and to pay attention. Even though I don't write every day, I tell myself and I tell my students that at least be a writer every day, right? Like, and that means paying attention to the world in a certain way and making I have a little blank notebook that I write something down. And even the poem I just read about cutting my finger, I just kept on looking at that cut day after day after day. And like the poem was happy. I didn't even know I was going to write a poem about it, but somehow that paying attention ended up in what do I want to write about today? Oh, remember that finger I cut? So I think that's part of my process too, is just to always be paying attention to the world. And then what makes it to the page makes it to the page. A lot of it doesn't make it to the page, but that's important to me. So in a way, we're always writing, even though I don't write every day per se. Like you said, it's not that sitting at the desk all the time, but in some ways, I try to pay attention to the world and think about the world through the eyes and through the lens of poetry every single day. I think that's a very important thing. And the other thing I wanted to add to maybe what Rick said was that I also pay attention to my own work. In other words, like sometimes I always say my poems are smarter than me because my subconscious knows what it's concerned about. So like I was saying, like suddenly I pulled out, the last 8 or 9 poems I was writing about, they're all about death. So I'm like, okay, there's got to be something there. Let's keep on going with that. So that I pay attention to what my poems are doing too. And that gives me a direction and inspires me to keep, to generate new poems as well. What's obsessing me at this moment? What is concerning me that my conscious mind may not know, but certainly my subconscious mind that's suffering, yes, surfacing through language that is pulling it up, is there right before my eyes. So
I love this. I love that we're a tribe of notebook keepers, and I think that's totally necessary. I also am an obsessive notebook keeper, and then I file my notebooks, and then eventually I'll go through them and sort of mine them for scraps that have shown up. But what the notebook is about is kind of what Richard and Rick were talking about, which is giving yourself permission to listen and to watch your mind. And I think of it both as listening and watching. Sometimes the most interesting thing is that you overhear very rhythmic music in your mind, and you write down the delightful combination of words that's kind of nattering away at the inner ear. And you notice that you have a bit of music and you don't know what that's for. Or for instance, I published a book about Dorothea Lange, but I was like following her work and thinking about her for 10 years before I even knew that I was writing a book. And I just knew that some obsession was building and following. And a piece of advice that I think is really fabulous is there's a rock star who was just every so often overhearing in his ears a country western song. And he didn't say to himself, I'm a rock musician, I don't write country western songs. He just wrote down the country western songs. And then one day he opened his folder and he found that he had 10 country western songs. I think his name is Ben Queller. But what I love about that is just giving yourself permission to listen to what your brain is working out and write it down. Don't judge it. Wait and see what it may become. trust that it may reveal itself to you. It might take 10 years, or it might go into a funny folder for a little while. And I think that feeling that you are listening and watching and taking notes builds on itself into a practice. So anyway, I'm like, I love that we all have our notebooks together.
I just wanted to add quickly something that I think this idea of the notebook really highlights. And I think we're probably going to talk about this in my workshop, which is that poems start small. They don't start with the kind of the big concept that now I'm going to write a poem about love. Now I'm going to write a poem about, grief. No, you start a poem for the most part with noticing, the pairs of shoes lined up at the front door. And you ask, what does that mean? When you go outside on a walk and there's a Coke can in the ditch, and that catches your eye. And the poem becomes kind of a space for inquiry as to why did I notice those shoes lined up, or that Coke can, or that face that seemed to appear in the tree trunk. And then the poem kind of like leads you to a place where you can begin to kind of maybe understand that, oh, that's aligned with something like grief, or something like pain, or something like memory. But I think that the best poems begin there at that kind of small scale of the human. And then it kind of broadens out into something that's more conceptual or abstract. But you have to start with the small, and that's where the ethos of the notebook, I think, that's where you can practice that ethos.
I like that idea of the poem as a question, and questions starting with what are you noticing and where does that lead you? I am in the middle of this June 30-30 poetry challenge for Tupelo Press, and it's about writing 30 poems in 30 days. And it's, the one thing I've learned is that if you show up, the muse shows up. And surprisingly, in all these funny little places, what the three of you are talking about, what you're noticing, and then noticing what you're noticing if there are themes that are showing up in the poems. So I think the next question I would ask you is something about, some people say you can't teach poetry, yet you're all teachers of poetry. So can you just talk a little bit about your philosophy of that, and how do you approach teaching in your workshops or courses?
Well, I think we can cultivate. I think that we are all have all of these senses, and we can heighten them. And somebody who learns a little bit about wine tasting is going to have greater pleasure in tasting wine, and somebody who learns a little something about symphonies is going to have greater pleasure in listening to symphonies. And I think that when we come together to talk about poetry, we're building our vocabulary of our pleasure. And I always talk to my students a lot about being led by your pleasure, being really specific about your pleasure. What about that poem interested you? What about that image feels strong? And using that as a guide towards having this experience where you're reading and critiquing, or following your pleasure, revising towards your pleasure in a poem. And there's so many ways of beginning to name and language our delight. And I really want people to feel like they are confident in describing the textures and the sounds and the adjectives, and the places where writing feels really alive. And as we move in that process, the writing becomes more alive. We all write towards more alive spaces. Now, my poem, your poem won't be the same ever. In fact, we're each trying to get to that thing that is uniquely ours, uniquely ours to say, and the music that's uniquely ours when as we say it. But I think that we do that partly by refining our sense of pleasure and honoring that pleasure, much the same way that the notebook is a place for you to have that little squib of delight. Then you come back and you refine that process. What's the best part of that? What's the most interesting and alive part of what I just got down? So that's kind of how I approach it. And it feels good. It feels really good to work that way.
I know you do that in your workshops. You start with what are the pleasures of this film, and then just open it up wide from there. So
I try to teach in a way that um this last class I had a undergraduate class, I made them call me Coach Blanco. And the idea is that I guess my sort of approach to teaching poetry is that just like a coach in a way, like you're there to give people drills, you're there to give them tricks, show them moves and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you're their partner in creation, right? Like but you got to make, they're the ones who have to go out in the field and practice or get on stage and practice and whatnot. And so that's become more and more of being an ally with your writers, because we all know that, and it's sometimes interesting because there's still this myth sometimes, even in college classes, where they think the poem falls out of the sky, and I think they have to realize that it doesn't fall out of the sky, right? And that's really, just that alone is eye-opening for them, just to understand that's showing up, and that it's still work, and that we're still terrified when we reach the blank page, or when we sit in front of the blank page. But as they say, if it were easy, everybody would do it, right? But just the idea that to be an artist is always, in a way, to be part of something that does not exist, and that is a very scary yet thrilling place to be in our lives. And I try to always create the analogy of, look, you want to be a football player. What do? You got to, first of all, you got to learn the rules of the game, right? You got to read the rule book, right? Then after that, you got to rehearse and practice. And you might have a great game. Does that mean you're going to have a great game the next game? Maybe not. Because you had a great season, as you won the Super Bowl, does that mean you're going to win it next year? No, of course not. So that nobody ever has that. So that sort of, you never stop learning about poetry. But there is a process of it, and that in many ways it mimics there's not that much mystery to it in my book. It's like almost everything in life. You want to be a good parent, you want to be a good dancer, you want to be a good engineer. You start learning piece by piece, you practice, you get better at it. But you also are always, there's failures too along the way all the time, and that's fine. I think, like Rick said, that nothing is ever wasted in a way either, because even those failures or those attempts, we could call them, that they always teach us something. So yeah, I'm Coach Blanco. That's my approach, I think. And the other idea is a kind of an apprenticeship, right? That we're here to be facilitators in many different ways, and try to meet the student at where they're at and in their process. And Yeah, I think that's what I've landed on lately.
well, Coach, I have to say that you often ask great questions of the poet, and I heard one of them in my voice today as I read back a poem I'd written. It's like, whose poem is this anyway? That was one of your questions. So.
One of my patented questions. Yes.
I'll just add one thing that, first of all, I want to affirm what Tess and Richard just said. Tess's point that, poems come out of kind of ample pleasure and generosity. I think that's absolutely true. And that's something that I care about in my own teaching, fostering that kind of generosity in my students. But also Richard's point about the fact that poetry is a practice that's also involved with rigor and care and craft. So how do you alchemize that kind of generosity and that kind of craft in poems? That's something that I think I can teach. But what I want to add is this, really going back to your question, Meg, about your observation that people say that poetry cannot be taught. And I want to say this, when I hear that, I always go on high alert as a listener, because for me, that claim is attached to a set of other claims that I think are really problematic. One is that poetry is supposed to be a certain way, that it's supposed to sound a certain way, that it's supposed to read a certain way, and it's supposed to be valuable in a certain way. And those are value judgments that are really kind of, I think we should look at those kinds of judgments about what poetry ought to be, because they're usually attached to ideas about who should be writing poetry, what bodies, what people, what experiences belong in poetry, who belongs in a room where poetry is written and talked about. Who, and a corollary to that is who is excluded, who isn't supposed to be writing poetry, who are the people who don't look like they have poetry in them or the capacity to write poetry. So that notion that poetry can't be taught, we should all look at that a little bit askance and wonder, whose property is being protected by that idea, whose ownership of poetry is being protected by that idea, because there's an ethical quandary attached to that claim. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now, but that's what I wanted to add about those sorts of ideas about, what poetry ought to be.
Great soapbox. I mean, and it's sort of one of those wake-up calls we need. Like, what are those rules and who made them? And who do they keep out? So, I do welcome any questions that people want to put in the chat. I've been just putting little comments as each of you talk. I have a couple of other questions I'm dying to ask. One is kind of to talk about the process of revision, and you've all talked a little bit about that, but I don't think any of you said that poems come from the sky fully formed, but how do you go about revising a poem, and does it take varying lengths of time depending on the poem, and do you have techniques you use to go into your own poems to revise them?
So I can start. I don't think I've started yet.
Great.
I much like Rick's aversion to can poetry be taught. I kind of have this really over the years I've grown to have a deeper and deeper sort of aversion to the word revision, because it kind of implies that we finish a poem and then we revise it, right? This idea, and I think what we were saying from the very beginning, that the poem is already being written and revising from the moment you put it in your notebook, right? Like there's something happening already. So I don't, I think I try to tell my students that, it is this linear process, like, okay, now I finished a draft and I'm ready to write a poem, but the idea that it's an iterative process, and that the revision process is just as creative as the genesis of the poem at times, because you might reach a certain stopping point in the poem where you got to rethink the poem, right? And the poem's not finished. You're not revising it. You're just having to wait a minute. Where's this poem going? So I just see it as one continuous process. And then I would say what we call proper revision is sometimes, okay, then you do get to that good draft and maybe there's editing going on, a tweaking of a word here or there, sounds that you didn't get quite right, that you want to play with the musicality of the poem. But to me, writing and revision are just a continuous interwoven process, for me at least. And that being said, there are times where I have to put poems away. I think we're probably all going to say that in some way, shape, or form, right? I try to give myself a week to get to a space in a poem. And if not, I'll just put it away, because I'm realizing that something in my subconscious is not ready. It has to sit in there somewhere in the back of my mind for a while. So that to me is a form of revision. Not writing is a form of revision, if that makes sense. Putting things away is a form of revision. But it is to me. I just don't. I just want to put that out there, because I think I've been guilty of the same thing. The key is in revision, and what we're really saying is the key is like to continuously challenge the poem at every single line, right, and go over it and over and over and over and over again, and it's when it's done, so to speak. But it's not this neat process where we're You know, we enter a revision stage. It's like I'm revising every single time I write a line. I mean, I can spend an hour on a line of poetry, right? And so it's always there in some ways present, not just a separate process in and of itself.
Mm. Other comments on revision?
I have a couple of ways that I like to revise or work on revision. One is, I mean, I think the first step is really to thin things usually. My sense is that a lot of times things come out with a little bit of extra stuff and there's some sort of weediness in there, verbs or adjectives that maybe aren't doing as much work. And you kind of go towards heat and towards strangeness and towards aliveness in the language. And when you do a first cut for that, it suddenly is a lot clearer what could possibly go there. Another thing that's really, really useful is to remember that poetry is sharing breath that's rooted in bodies. And when you are entering somebody's poem, you're actually entering their orchestration for breath. And so, you know, we live in this world now where sometimes we think if we just move our thumb and our eyes like a little bit, we're having an experience of language. But of course, language happens all the way through our body. It happens in our breath, it happens in our ears, it happens in our mouth, it happens with our tongue, and it's incredibly bodily. And so when you read your poem aloud, it will tell you where it's strong and where it's not strong. Language will also be telling you, is this musical? Is this powerful? You know, and so that's a wonderful thing to use the poem as an occasion to really ground yourself in your experience of language in your mouth and in your body. And that can be really transformative for people to feel like they are building something that is like really lifts off and has delivery and has strangeness and aliveness. So those are things. And then I just wanted to share something that I've been thinking about recently, which I think could be a really, really great revision helper, which is just to edit with sound in mind. And this is Virginia Woolf to Vita Sackville West. And she goes, "Style is a very simple matter. It is all rhythm. Once you get that, you can't use the wrong words." And I just love the idea that we're writing somehow towards our understanding of what it must sound like. And that sometimes our ear can dance with this sense of what the words should be. And the words in relationship to that, as we're kind of mining that space, we sometimes come up with things that are brighter and fresher and stranger than we knew that we needed to say. So, so anyway, that's kind of how I go about it. And
Thank you. Thank you.
I love getting to have this collaborative, like it's super fun to get to feel like I'm spying on, like taking notes on Rick's stuff. Right? Speaking of notebook keeping and.
Well, I love being able to go last because I can just say ditto and ditto. I really do love Richard's notion that, you know, one principle to bring into revision is the idea of challenging what it is that you put down, you know, to kind of keep prodding at the entity on the page and asking if it has the kind of viability that you hope it does, and then bringing that thing to realization. And I also love Tess's idea that, you know, poetry, even though it seems to be something that's on the page, it's an experience of embodiment. And that, you know, why do we have sounds in poems to remind us that we have ears? Why do we have images in poems to remind us that we have eyes? Why do we have rhythms and meters in poems to remind us that we have these physiological rhythms that, you know, determine, you know, our beings? So it's really important to keep that in mind in your own poems, that kind of fullness of response in the reader is, you know, fullness in their sense of embodiment. The thing that I will add maybe to this issue of revision is to ask the question of the poem that is in front of you that you're working on, who is the audience for this? And I want to give you all permission to think that each poem that you write doesn't always have the same audience. meaning that there are those poems that you write that are simply for yourself. And you know that that poem is for you. And no matter how coded or gnarled or obscure that poem is, you understand what's happening there, right? And you are the audience for that poem. And it's okay to keep it like that.
Mm.
And then there's the poem that you write that has a coterie audience. Maybe it's your family or your friends who will understand some of the codes which are happening in there. And therefore, you work on the poem with that audience in mind. And that's okay too, that you keep it at that level. And then there are those poems that you write that you want everybody to be able to experience, right? And once you understand that that poem is that way, that activates a whole lot of obligations on your part as a poet to make the experience of that wide audience exactly the way you hope and want it to be. And that's when craft comes in to, to help you to translate that poem into an experience that everybody can inhabit. But I guess my takeaway is that, revision should be aligned with that question of who the audience is. And the revision process doesn't have to be the same for every poem, knowing that sometimes you don't need to do much because it's only for yourself.
Mm.
But if there's a poem that you want to be, let's say, in a magazine that's going to be read by many, many people, well, then that obligates you to do certain things to that poem to make sure that everybody gets it.
And
I
it
wanna,
speaks to the value of having readers. I'm sorry, Richard, go ahead.
no, I just wanted to just those things to as a tail end to that. I also about sound. I read Tess. I read my poems out loud like a madman at 3 a.m, and it's like if I can't feel it in my body, and my body is kind of an editor. If I'm tripping
Body
over
is an
words,
editor. Yeah.
yeah, I can't feel it, and then and so I'm constantly, and that's part of the tools of editing, or part of the, again, the revision process, the writing process, and however messy that is. But and it's really interesting until I hear that one line, that I can hear that sound. That's kind of Richard the poet singing, not Richard the guy cussing people out on I-95. Um, I can't commit to the poem until I have some sound that makes me think this is a poem, right? Or it's the beginning of the poem. And to Rick, I just want to say too, getting to the question that I always ask my class of whose poem is this. Um, I always say the first and correct answer always is, it's your poem. It's your poem first, and then it's everybody else's poem. In the sense that that you are ultimately, that stream, that emotional grounding of something you care about deeply should not be lost in revision for the sake of, because sometimes that gets revised out, right? But the idea of holding on to that idea of, like, that the poem is yours, that we want to hear you and what's in your body, what's in your mind, your body, what are you hearing, tasting, smelling, touching. And I would add into the conversation about revision that sometimes there's a danger in washing that out. And I always come back to that grounding. Why the hell did I start writing this poem? Oh, that's why, because I've got my finger. So when the poems go a little stray, I always try to bring them back into that emotional center or reason for being.
Later this week, I'll give craft classes, which is kind of fun. And I'm really excited to tune in for both of these wonderful craft classes. And the one that I'm giving about is called Staging the Poem. And it does really have to do with some things that I'm thinking about revision, which are kind of like what Rick was talking about, which have to do with sort of clarifying the occasion for the poem and knowing why we're there. And if you think of these poems that we love in the world, like John Donne, busy old fool, unruly sun, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains spy on us? It's, you understand, he's a dramatist. He's writing at the same, he's the same rough era as Shakespeare. And we understand, lights up, man on stage addressing celestial body, man talks to sun. And even though that's kind of a weird occasion to the poem, having a sense of the speed of knowing, like what this channel of breath is for, why this speech, no matter what. And I think that that has to do a little bit with that dance between privacy and publicity that Rick is talking about, of feeling like we clarify, like what reason did this poem need to get going right away? And is it able to kind of just start from its silence into its noise while letting us all take its journey with it? And some of that is actually can be thought about in some of the terms of stagecraft a little bit. So I'm excited to talk about that in the craft classes. That's one of the cool things that happens when you join us for the week, is that we workshop together. We have this week of classes, and then we have these moments to reflect on something that's like, you know, a way of talking about craft that each, and I'm so excited for everybody else's as well. I think there's one about syntax. Is that was
Yeah.
That's you. Yeah. And
So
Rick
Rick is teaching about syntax.
I'm teaching about syntax.
Yep.
And Richard, your craft seminar is?
Kind of a little bit what Tess is talking about too, like you know what, and both Rick, like what is, we're thinking about what is a memorable poem, right? Or like what is a good poem, but what are those poems that stick with us? Even our own work, right? Sometimes we write poems that get published in like, you know, 80 places, and we're like, how did that happen? And trying to look at things that are qualities that we can't always put a finger on, that it's not just saying, oh, this is a good metaphor, but really a large idea of what's happening in that poem that really makes it stand out. And sometimes it is that idea that it's very clear about its occasion and what it wants to say, or it's very clear about its stance, right? It knows what, you know, like it knows its audience, right? And you know, things is more of a conversation than really a craft, you know, how to, but really looking at this poem that we all have our favorite poems, and thinking about why is it that these poems, it's a conversation more, I think, beyond merely craft, right? At least not in that cold way that we think about craft, but something else is going on. So having some of those conversations, and just well, what Tess was saying too, as well as occasion, is such an incredible, you know, everybody, you know, thinks about, you know, occasional poems as like the kiss of death, or the idea that right, like what is an occasional poem? I know that technically there's a difference between an occasional poem and like what Rick was saying, in a way, is also occasion, right? Like, who am I writing? What is my audience is thinking about occasion in a way too, right? But that I always tell my students, every poem is an occasional poem, because you experience something that's an occasion of which you now have to sort of translate through language and sound and metaphor and whatnot into unpacking what that moment means to you, and then therefore also to your audience. So it's interesting that I'd love to hear that, the occasion of a poem, because I've always had to learn it. I've always thought about it in a different way, till I had to write a real occasional poem. Now I'm realizing that they're all occasions. They're all occasions to say something, to feel something.
That's great.
Well, they're also a
Sure.
response to something. I mean, the idea that every poem is a response to something, even if the event it's responding to is off stage, you know, that it's not explicitly mentioned in the poem. And so that might be a really interesting other way of thinking about revision, that, you know, what happened in the moment before the poem started. I love thinking about Ode to a Nightingale by Keats, where if you really think about that poem, it's a response to hearing the nightingale. And that's what happens the moment before the poem happens. And the poem starts kind of in medias res, right? It's already thinking about, you know, responding to that occasion that is not at all described in the poem itself. I really love what Tess said about kind of thinking about occasion, because it also made me remember that one of the things I talk about with my students has to do with kind of understanding in revision, what is the kind of major modality that the poem is in. I teach this British critic named Donald Davie, who said in a kind of irresponsibly kind of grand way that poems really can be broken down to three things. He said that a poem can be written like theater. It's dramatized, sort of like what Tess just said. And his example for somebody who dramatizes in their poetry is Yeats. And then he said a poem is like music, that the act of writing or making the poem is about conducting music. And he uses T.S. Eliot as a example of that. And his third modality for poetry is that it is like sculpture. You take a big hunk of material and you kind of shape it down into something shapely. And his example for that is Pound, who he thinks of as a carver. And there are more modalities than those three that Davy talks about, but that might be an interesting way of thinking about your own poems and the revision process for that particular poem. Is this a poem that is in the mode of, drama? Excuse me, is it in the mode of music, or is it in the mode of sculpture? And then kind of bringing that kind of perspective to the work of bringing the poem to wherever it needs to go. So understanding the category of occasion and the category of modality for the poem.
I hope you're all taking notes. This is great. I want to make sure we get to, there are a couple of questions in the chat that before we wrap up with hopefully a poem from each of you, but Ellen Goldsmith is asking, for many big events, it takes a while to write a poem. And many of us have been writing about the pandemic in real time. And she's wondering about your thoughts about why, and also how these poems will resonate in another 20 years or so.
I mean, this was a really interesting thing, because I think that what Rick did, Rick's book during the pandemic was one of my favorite books last year. And I had the opportunity to talk about it sometime on the radio, and I just really loved that. And I was in awe of how present he could be so quickly to both the strangeness and these like tiny details, like those lists on the refrigerator. I was not able to do anything like that. I just really couldn't. I kept an insomniac's journal in the middle of the night because it was so wild during the day where I was living, and I just tried to keep records of the strangeness of the time. But I knew that I wasn't like writing poems. I knew that I wasn't producing in real time. And then when I did start writing, what came out was very, very sideways. It was like, like almost like the pressure of the year was on the poems, but I'm not sure that the poems that I'm writing right now say the word pandemic ever. And I think that we just have to be aware that we can respond to things in different registers. All of our poems are always political. There's always a politics to what we choose, but there's actually not a field of like, you have to put this in or leave this out. You have to say this or say that. The way that we respond to things can take a really long time. And so maybe my poem about onions that doesn't say anything about the pandemic is a pandemic poem, And so I think that just sort of being open to the fact that we can come from all these places is really important. But also just knowing that if you did use the word pandemic and everything did feel very much in a particular time, you've got this capsule, and we don't know how we're going to feel in 10 years. Somebody once asked a historian what they thought of the French Revolution, like what they thought it had done to the world. And she said, it's too soon to know. So I think that it's too, poems will go. I think, for instance, that Rick's poems will be an amazing record for many, many years to come. Whether everything that we wrote this year will be that way, or whether it will morph into something else, or whether it will feel like an important time capsule, or whether the thing that comes out will be utterly influenced by this experience, but never say the word pandemic. All of those are options,
That's so interesting way to think about it, because I wonder if there are poems that were written during the Spanish flu or whatever that we go back to. Certainly that era is one that we go back to look for inspiration or understanding today. We have another question about, you've all talked about sound and rhythm. What about the visual? What about the look of the poem? on a page? Do you think about that? And how do you think about that?
Well, I'll just quickly say that I've always lived by T.S. Eliot's idea that a poem communicates before it is understood. And when you see a poem on the page looking a certain way, that's communicating something to you before you've actually read a single word of it. So, paying attention to how a poem, whether it looks orderly or fragmented or somewhere in between on the page, that's saying something to the reader about what the intellectual and emotional and narrative experience will be like for them. And so maybe that's something to think about as you're arranging the visual kind of experience, even separate from the actual experience of, reading the poem itself. It's something to keep in mind that it all communicates, even if it's not, understood by the mind, it's understood, it's registered by the body in some way. And you want to harness that for the reader.
Yeah, I'll echo that too. I always and Meg knows this in class. I'll just hold up the poem, and it's already giving you an impression of something about that poem. But to add to what you're saying, Rick, I think it's really interesting to watch over and over again when a poem starts creating its own sort of organic structure, or form, line lengths, or stanziation, and then it starts, and somehow it drops out somewhere in the middle. Usually that's the part of the poem that needs some more work because it's still the form and the function and trying to work together. And 9 times out of 10, there's something in that where it gets fuzzy structurally or visually, where it gets fuzzy, that where the poem is losing itself a little bit or wants to sort of find its way back in. And I've always found that fascinating too. And again, I don't think these are processes that happen simultaneously, right? You're looking for language, you're looking for form, you're looking for sound, and all these things sort of combine to create that poem, and only that poem in a way. And I'll just say too that sometimes part of our journey as writers in terms of style, right, is trying to see what that structure is. What is it that our poems look like on the page? And then it can also become, for me, I fight against that too, because I have the default line length. I have the default kind of, stanza that I like. I'm like, is this poem demanding something different than it's also great to always, like you said, Rick, to always question that, like, what is going on structurally, visually in the poem that demands something different, because this poem is speaking differently. And so it also wants to look differently than the default, the baseline that we spend years cultivating to then fight against ourselves to challenge ourselves.
I remember that when I was in grad school, our professor made us look at this line, "Oh, like the lizard in the furious noon." And we're like, just looking at it. Why is that line? Why that line? And we're sort of sitting there banging our heads against the wall. And he said, "Look, don't you see the eyes of the lizard? The noon, they're in don't you see the lizard sitting there with his eyes, that the word is making a little portrait for you? There's a little glyph." And it was this funny thing where suddenly then I did see it. I did see, "Oh, like the lizard in the furious noon." We're looking at this and I see this little strange sensation that the word is also a picture. And words are also pictures. And I think just the way words are also music. And I love this notion that the poem communicates before it's understood, because we understand the music and we also see the glyphs. And we're going to discount that in this world where we're thinking about meaning as if it's this transactive thing that we can kind of get out of language. But if we allow ourselves to be in the sense of language and enjoy the multiple sensory dimensions of language, and I talked a lot about the ear, but the eye is really important too. One of the ways that I've heard it described is the solar meaning of a poem and the lunar meaning. And the lunar meaning being more like the shadowy sensations that are sort of produced by the shapes of language themselves, the particularly interesting word. the pleasure of like the two Y's in synergy kind of lying there. And you know, that is a part of our sense of language that isn't like cultivated in your 9th grade essay writing class, you know, when you're trying to just get to the point and make your thesis statement and make your topic sentences. But when you open up to that part of language, it is so rewarding, both on the musical level and on the eye level. So it's absolutely something to think about. And I think it is something that we come to poetry for. Many of us who love poetry love that feeling of the kind of beautiful rightness of the look of the words on a page.
You know, not just that too, but I was just going to put a punctuation mark on what Tess just said, that I think one of the distinctions we can make between our work as poets and all of the other writers, including nonfiction writers and fiction writers, is that we really care. Those writers, I think, privilege language as denotative. Mm-hmm. We as artists love the connotative potential of language. And so that's why we do what we do as poets. And I think what Tess just said is absolutely important, that to actually embrace the connotative spread that every word brings to us, that's part of the job. Prose writers don't necessarily think that way. They're kind of committed to the denotative. We're not. That's the difference.
Nice. You know, this has been a great conversation. I'd love to have it continue, but we're sort of, and I want to lead out with a poem again from each of you, but I just want to say, I noticed a few people signing in right as we're finishing, and I'm wondering if they're students. And so I'd like to ask each of you if you are planning to meet with your students tonight after this class, or not until tomorrow, Monday, at noon Eastern time, whatever time that is for you.
I'd love to say hello to students just really quickly and just, I mean, we don't have that much to talk about, but it's so nice to just get a jump on saying hello.
Great. And they should log in on their Zoom link that was sent out by Maine Media to meet with you.
Yeah, we're supposed to meet at 5:30.
Great.
Yeah, and jumping in here, hi, I'm Abby, the TA. But I think that people were going to use the Poets Corner link to just stay on for the informal gathering instead of switching onto the class link.
Well,
was what I was told by Devin.
I wasn't told that by Devin, and I think each of them want their own, meet with their own class, not all classes. So I can't manage that with breakout rooms.
Okay.
Yeah. So if that's okay, I think you've all got links. So Rick, are you planning to meet?
Well, I will just say that I don't need to meet, but my students are going to get an email from me shortly with information for tomorrow. And so we can get going tomorrow. We don't need to do that today after this event. They'll get an email from me.
But Richard, you are, right?
Yes.
Okay. And Abby, welcome. Good to see you.
Hi, it's good to see you too.
Sounds
good.
Do we have time for a poem from each of you before you head into your class? Meeting with your class? Or are you worried about them being there without you, Richard?
Yeah, I guess, because I mean, I guess they're all here, but I can't tell from the
I don't know if they are.
Brady Bunch.
Well, maybe what we'll do is just leave people wanting more and telling them that they can come back Tuesday night for Rick Barot, Wednesday night for Tess Taylor, Thursday night for Richard Blanco, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. If you're not on the Maine Media Alumni Network email list and you want a link, just email Beth Story at Maine Media. So it's bstorey@mainemedia.edu. So I'll close it here. As much as I hate to close it, I just want to thank all of you for being here and for a great conversation. I'm glad it's recorded. I'll go back and take more notes. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
I'm sorry, Meg, I'm confused. I'm in Richard's group. Do I stay on to meet with him now?
No, you have to go to the Zoom link that was provided to you by Maine Media. I think Devin Fletcher sent it out,
Okay,
and he'll
I
be there.
go there. Thank you so much.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. And is there any way that I can find Meg's poem or Tess's poem on
poem.
patient?
Oh, good question. Sorry, I didn't ask that. I will ask her
Thank you.
later, and I'll make sure you get that,
I
Linda.
think I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Okay, bye. Thank you.
Bye.
This was wonderful, by the way. Thank you.
Great, thanks for being here.
I'm thrilled.
Okay, Catherine, I think we'll end the session now. Thanks.